Our second speaker on the subject Bandit Problems in Ethical Clinical Trials will be given by Bill Press at the University of Texas at Austin. In 1976, 4 years after his Caltech PhD, Bill became the youngest full professor at Harvard who had tenure. He stayed for 20 years and has, since that first position, engaged in a truly remarkable number of interesting but very different subjects. Theoretical astrophysics, computational biology, cosmology, computational algorithms. He's been on an innumerable number of government and non-governmental committees of interest to anyone who wants to look at more detail. He has written a textbook on numerical recipes, which has sold almost 400,000 hardcover copies. And I'm told that the movie rights are being negotiated. And Bill Press will be played by Brad Pitt. But as usual, it's better to hear about all of these things from Bill himself. Please.
So several of the previous speakers have taken us all, and especially Freeman, on walks down memory lane on the famous and important papers that Freeman has worked on, or that the speakers have worked on with Freeman. I had only had the pleasure of writing a paper with Freeman a year ago, and I thought it would be a little extreme to reminisce with Freeman about a paper that was just published. So although I considered that, I decided instead to talk about a problem that I wished I had worked on with Freeman, and maybe still will get the chance to do so. Of course, he'll be the judge of that. Here's a game you could play with 2 coins, and we're going to play it with 2 specific coins. They're right here, and I'm going to give them to Freeman as part of his birthday present.
Thank you.
One of them is a 1919 British penny that was a bright young penny when Freeman was a bright young penny in circulation, and it's still looking not too bad. And the other is 1984, an Orwellian year. It's a British pound, so we won't reminisce on what had changed in the British Empire between those 2 dates. But back to the game. The game, Freeman, is very simple. I pay you $1 every time you flip one and get a heads, and you pay me $1 every time you get a tails. Okay, so what could be simpler? The British penny, it's not actually clear which is heads and which is tails, because King George V is on the back of that penny. But we would agree on a convention and play the game. Now, you get to pick which coin to flip each side, each time. And as you see, the coins are distinguishable. But what I haven't told you yet, and I'm now going to tell you, is neither one of those is supposed to be a fair coin. They might be weighted to be very unfair. It might be that one of them always comes up heads, or 80% of the time or something. I didn't actually find a way of doing that to those coins, but you're supposed to bear with me on this. This is not a feature of the usual form of this game, but you'll see why it's going to be a feature of our application. You don't get to know when the game is going to end. We're just going to play and play and play, and we'll still be playing at Freeman's 100th birthday and so on and so forth. So this is actually a well-known game in decision theory. It's called a 2-armed Bernoulli valued bandit problem. That's the usual term, with an unknown horizon. And it's called a bandit problem because of a different metaphor, not the coin flipping metaphor, but the metaphor you see here. It's a slot machine with 2 arms. And you get to pick which arm you're going to pull each time, in the same way that Freeman gets to pick which coin he's going to flip each time. And the question is, how do you decide on each move which coin to flip? Or should you play at all? because one of the coins may be weighted very much in your favor and the other one very much against you, okay? But you can only discover that by actually flipping. So there's a trade-off between gaining information and exploiting that information that you've gained, and that's what makes it an interesting problem. Now, we learned yesterday that Freeman is comfortable thinking about lattices in high-dimensional spaces. And this game, the space is really only four-dimensional Freeman, piece of cake. Because if we play for a while, then at any given point, the state of the game is four integers. It's how many times did he choose the British pound coin and get heads, or choose that coin and get tails, or choose the other coin and get heads, or the other coin and get tails, okay? So the state of the game, let's see if I can do it, get my arrow here. Can you see the arrow? Yeah, okay. So the state of the game at any given point in time is just some point on this lattice, the positive four-dimensional lattice, and on the very next move from this point, we're going to increase one of those coordinates by one, because either Freeman will choose A, and then we'll have either a win on A, or a head on A, or a tails on A, or he'll choose B, and we'll have either the corresponding thing on B. And so we progress upward through this lattice. So the mathematical question is, what strategy maximizes your expected total success without knowing in advance these hidden probabilities that I've told you how badly weighted are the coins? Now, the imp in me says, are you crazy? This is way too much math for a public affairs session. So I'm going to leave the math aside for some number of slides. And probably if you don't like the math at all, you'll have time to sort of sneak out of the tent before it comes back. But I now want to tell you, because this is a public affairs session, about clinical trials. So in my humble, and all of my friends laugh if I ever say in my humble opinion, there's a lot wrong with clinical trials in the United States today. Clinical trials, when we're trying to decide whether to approve a drug or a medical treatment more generally, are typically run by contract research organizations, often for-profit companies that specialize in administering clinical trials. And these trials would typically be paid for either by a drug company, by pharma, or possibly by the federal government. Clinical trials, although they represent themselves as being a scientific endeavor, if you really look at what are they optimized to do, they're optimized to take a drug through frictionless approval by the FDA. Because the people paying for the trials would like to see new drugs on the market, either for profit or for the public welfare. There's a lot of history of what kinds of trials sail through the FDA versus trying anything, dare we say, creative, which can only create problems for you downstream. So there's a gold standard for what a clinical trial should look like, for the statistics of it. And that's a gold standard of which Ronald Fisher in about the year 1930 would approve. That's also harking back to Freeman's early years and the influence of probably still the world's greatest statistician, albeit 80 years ago. And typically what this gold standard looks like, these are things that I assume most people have learned before, is you sign up M patients for a clinical trial, and you divide them randomly into two samples or arms, each with half the patients. And you give treatment A, the drug you want to approve, to one of the arms, to M over 2 patients, and you do this double blind so that the patients don't know what they're getting, and so on and so forth. And you give an alternative treatment, which might be no treatment at all. It might be a placebo. Or if there's already a standard of care, a drug on the market or a treatment on the market, that the other arm might be that standard of care treatment. And you run the trial and see if you can see a statistical difference between the two trials. Now, a wrinkle in this is that it's obvious that you're going to give half of the patients the worst treatment, by definition almost. And that's not ethical if you know that it's the worst treatment, right? So there's a safety monitoring board associated with every clinical trial that watches the results coming in, and they can recommend an early termination. And the reason I put recommend in quotes is I believe that no clinical trial has ever continued past the moment that its safety board recommends an early termination. And if you look at how this is done, first of all, there are no clear standards at all. It's not a cut and dried thing. Now, you can defend that. You can say every trial is a little different. You know, they have to have some discretion. But they also have more or less complete discretion on how they do the statistics. So they all tend to do it actually the same way, and we're back to Ronald Fisher, and it's a p-value test, and any modern statistician would consider it a very backward methodology, actually. What's the result of this? The result of this is probably on average, as I'm going to show you, inferior treatments are given to more patients in a clinical trial than need be true. But it's also true that often good drugs are probably mistakenly rejected by this protocol. Now, the clinical trials are finite. In fact, this is back to the first bullet. They're always about as small as the FDA will allow. And there's typically little or no follow-up over the lifetime of the drug other than some very basic reporting of really catastrophic effects. And why is that? Because once the drug is approved, the drug company, I hate to sound this cynical, may not want to know much more than they found out in the clinical trial. They lack incentive to spend more than is required. And the whole pharma business gets this kind of all-or-nothing jackpot mentality. Our drug was approved in phase 3 clinical trials. We're there. Our drug failed phase 3 clinical trials. We're never going to look at that drug again. But I think the worst part of this is the standard of whether it's approved is whether the drug is effective. And effective sounds like a good word, but effective means no worse than the existing standard of care. And it means no worse than on the basis of a rather small statistical sample. So therefore, a lot of the time it will be a little bit worse than, and as the trial is kept small enough, no one will know the difference, and we'll get our drug on the market. And in fact, if you look at the top-selling drugs in the United States, or the world for that matter, they tend to come in these copycat pairs for just this reason. First drug on the market vacuums up the market, but we can still make, if we're a different company, a second drug. It doesn't really have to be any better. In fact, it doesn't really have to be even quite as good because we've got at least a 50% chance that the clinical trial won't detect that. Okay, and so, you know, you have, I could go through it, the two leading stomach acid reducers. We have Lipitor and all of its cousins, all the statins on the market competing with each other, and I won't try to remember. This is Prozac, and the generic is Prozac now, and its competitors. These are two asthma drugs, and all of these drugs so far are among the top 15 selling drugs. So we've almost exhausted the list of 15, half of which are copycat drugs. And the other result of this is it's kind of as bad as you imagine. Big Pharma spends twice as much on promotion, marketing, and sales as it does on research, because that's where the incentives lie. So I put it to you that there's just something wrong with this picture, and it's kind of wrong at a fundamental level. Now, I'm not here to beat up on Big Pharma. I really believe that Big Pharma, like any industry, is simply optimizing within an incentive structure that's created for it. It's created for it by law, by regulation, by custom, and so on. And in this case, I think it's being created by what we might call bad regulatory science. If you remember the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you'll remember that Jessica Rabbit, who's shown here, says, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." And that's kind of my view of Big Pharma in this context. So why is now a good time to try to break out of this pattern? Well, what's really changing is that electronic medical records are now being adopted for millions and millions of patients, and eventually for probably everybody in the country. And electronic medical records let you track outcomes, let you track when a doctor chooses to prescribe treatment A as opposed to treatment B, if they are both copycat drugs on the market, what actually happened. And so this is a kind of a clinical trial, but it's hugely larger by 4 orders of magnitude, probably, than the kind of clinical trials that we do now. And this is going to get back to the Bandit problem. It's a clinical trial with potentially an unbounded horizon, because if 2 drugs are on the market and doctors are prescribing both and they're both pretty good, you don't know how long that trial is going to go. You want to exploit all the information as it comes along. It's also possible, if I have time to talk about, to include within this framework another parameter that's very little included now, and that's cost of treatment, that we have to think about the ethics of very carefully. This coming new world of electronic medical records and large-scale outcomes tracking raises a bunch of questions, both ethically and mathematically. We now have a infinite, figuratively speaking, number of patients in the clinical trial, and we don't want to assign half of infinity to the inferior treatment shown here in the cartoon of the walking the plank. So that we can go back and think about this mathematical question: what is the optimal protocol when there is no horizon and when you want to do something rational on this? So in case you haven't figured it out, our Bandit problem is not really going to be which of 2 coins we pick to flip. It's going to be which of 2 treatments do we assign to a patient who's coming along and whose outcome we're going to track. So the patient comes along, we have an ongoing infinite horizon clinical trial, right, between the 2 stomach acid drugs or something more serious, cancer treatments, whatever it might be. And we want to know, what is our strategy? What does the math tell us about which of these drugs we should recommend to each patient in turn as they come along? Okay, so that strategy that we talked about when we had the mathematical lattice slide is really this question: based on the successes and failures of each treatment thus far, what is the probability R with which we should assign the next patient to treatment A versus treatment B? And it may vary as we go through this lattice, accumulating more and more patients, and that's what we want to understand. And now the unknown probabilities A and B, the weighting of the 2 coins, is the unknown success rate for each of the drugs that we're trying to do. Or I should say, incompletely known success rate, because very quickly we're going to learn a lot. So I think I've said this: Bandit models capture a trade-off between a cost of gathering information and the benefit of using it. And this is nicely called in the literature the exploration versus exploitation dilemma. Some patients are going to be assigned to a treatment that we already suspect to be inferior. But maybe the safety board hasn't seen it pass that, Ronald Fisher p-value 0.05 significance test or whatever it is that they're using. And we want to minimize the harm to patients in some ethical way. So ethics meets mathematics here, because what does that mean in some ethical way? I gave you with the coins a pretty well-posed mathematical problem, and I'd like to now be able to give you an equally well-posed mathematical problem for this admittedly somewhat idealized view of clinical trials. So we're going to need some ethical principles, and then we're going to need to translate them into mathematics, which is a kind of a fun little exercise. The first principle that I'm going to assert, and I think in real life clinical trials do follow this principle, is Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian principle, that we should try to get the greatest good for the greatest number. And maybe not quite uniquely, but pretty directly, that implies something about the mathematics. Okay, ready for the scary slide? Okay, that implies that when we if what we're trying to optimize is over here on the left, the total cost. Oh, we do have a real point here. Okay, so over here, the total cost. That the utilitarian principle tells us that we should basically decide what is the cost to an individual patient probabilistically, and then we should basically add up the patients or take the expectation value over everything else in the problem once we decide what this little lowercase c is for each patient. Okay, and you can see there's some angle brackets because we marginalize over something and we sum over the patients, and I won't go through that. So the math is back. I can't apologize for it. Here it is. Here's another ethical principle. Our cost function should obey a principle that I'm going to call equality. The cost shouldn't depend on where a patient is in the trials, and the cost function shouldn't depend on how the other patients have done in the trials. I want to be able to look each patient in the eye and say, I'm optimizing something that has a term in the sum, which is the cost to you. And what that means is this very general little cost function, which is a function of sort of everything in the problem, actually just has to be a function of the two unknown probabilities, right? Those are the effectiveness of the true drugs, and the strategy, what we recommend to that particular patient as opposed to all the other patients, okay? Remember, R was basically our recommendation for whether it's treatment A or treatment B, as expressed as a probability. Okay, so we've simplified the problem. Here's another reasonable ethical principle, that the cost should actually be an expectation over the outcomes of the treatment to the patient. Because you could imagine that we could define a cost that depended on, was it a cloudy day today, or who was elected president? That's a real one. Okay. But if we exclude those, then we get an even greater simplification. The cost, if we recommend with probability R treatment A, that means R of the time will get treatment A, and there should be a piece of the cost that only depends on those two probabilities. And 1 minus R of the time will get treatment B, and so there should be a cost that depends only on the two probabilities on treatment B. And instead of writing this in terms of R, you can symmetrize the problem in terms of S, which goes from -1 to 1. And then what you're really saying here is that there's an even piece in AB, and then there's an odd piece in AB, and the outcomes are only affecting the odd piece, it turns out, if you write that out. But you'll see that leads to something cute in a minute. Now, bandit problems are usually studied in a financial context, like gambling in Las Vegas. And notice, I just want to say in passing, that this equality principle, which is very obvious to us in the context of clinical trials, is rejected roundly by economists in applying this to financial problems, because economists discount the future exponentially, okay? Whereas here, we say that even the most distant patient's life should be worth just as much as the patient who's in my office today. I know we could argue with that, but I'm not going to argue with that. And so that sort of moves this problem a little bit out of the standard economics or game theory literature on this stuff. So let's now think about let's actually write down some of these cost functions. And this is something we're not the first people to do this. People have debated this before in thinking about clinical trials, and there are various measures. This measure is called expected failures, EF. We want to minimize the expected failures. And what does that mean? Well, R of the time we assign treatment A, and it fails 1 minus little a of the time, so that's a failure. And 1 minus R of the time we assign treatment B, and that fails 1 minus B. So we want to minimize this expression, which I wrote in terms of R. And remember, in terms of this other variable S, you can do the algebra in your head. It comes out this, okay? But there are other people in the literature who argue that that's the wrong measure. And the right measure is expected successes lost. What's the difference? Well, we're getting down into the weeds here, but you can see basically it says, don't penalize A by its losses, penalize A by the difference between its losses and what B's losses would have been. Right? So this sounds very arcane, but it actually gives a different formula. Okay? And in the literature, people debate whether this or this is the better metric to use in understanding cost to patients. And the interesting thing is, these are actually the same, because this is the odd piece, and they have the same odd pieces. And we saw on the previous slide that the strategy could depend only on the odd piece. So there's a whole little sterile ethical debate in the literature that by simply mathematizing it, we see is no debate at all. You would arrive at the exact same strategy for what to recommend to a patient in these cases. So that's a little bit cute. So, okay, I think we've now made the problem pretty exact. Is there an exact solution for this problem? And the answer, and this is a well-known result, is if the horizon is finite, that means if Freeman knew in advance how many times I was going to let him flip the coin, then there's a beautiful little solution which is just a kind of a backwards recursion through that lattice back down to the origin, and you can figure out exactly what strategy at each point to assign. Interestingly, although we've let the strategy be probabilistic, it turns out to be deterministic. It turns out that every point on the lattice either gets a 1 or a 0, either treatment A or treatment B, deterministically in terms of what the track record is so far. So that's the good news. The bad news is to actually do that recursion scales as the horizon size to the 4th power. So that means when I play around with this on my little desktop machine, which is perhaps only 1,000 times more powerful than the Cray one was when I was a graduate student, I can do up to m equals 300 easily, and if I do it on a campus supercomputer, I can do up to m equals 3,000, but I can't possibly do m equals 1,000,000. Okay, even though there is an exact solution to this problem, I can't get it out into the range where I might be interested in doing it. So my only mathematical, or I would say even just heuristic contribution to this is I was interested, it seemed to me that if I could just look at the solution up to m equals 300, shouldn't I be able to just kind of guess what it is for larger m? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, it might be if I looked at it and saw some intricate fractal pattern of 1s and 0s that made no sense, then I wouldn't be talking to you about this today. But if I look at it and I just sort of see some obvious pattern, then maybe I can guess. So this is sort of, as Freeman knows on where we have collaborated before, I can guess solutions, but I can't even explain how I got there. And he can prove solutions, but he can't even explain to me how he proved them. That's a very unsymmetrical relationship, actually. Okay, so basically I guessed. See, the problem is this is 4-dimensional. When I say you just look at it, what does that mean? How do I look at this huge thing that's at the limits of what I can store in my computer in 4 dimensions? Well, you sort of guess that it's going to depend on the statistical significance of something, and it's going to depend on the size of the samples in a certain scaling way, and you play around with it. Eventually I produced a pretty picture like this, where I'll tell you what you're seeing here. I'm reducing the problem dimensionally to just 2 variables. They're listed here. They're basically, how sure am I that the blue treatment is better? So that's this axis, or the red treatment is better this direction. And how balanced are my sample sizes by now? Have I tried it on way more blue or on way more red? Okay. And with a little bit of fiddling, the dots are the exact solution. The dots are, each dot is working this recurrence relation back to the origin. Okay? And with a little bit of fiddling, you can get the blue dots to almost completely separate from the red dots. But if you look closely, they're not quite separated. You see there are a few red dots there. And you can guess an answer. So here's the answer. It basically is just some little formula that you can do in a pocket calculator that predicts whether this big recursion is going to result in a blue dot or a red dot. Okay, this is the point where I now know that if I had been working with Freeman, Freeman would have produced in about a day the exact asymptotics of this, or maybe even the exact solution of it, including the special cases of these little dots that are on the wrong side. But in my defense, this little prescription calls the color of the dot correctly 99.51% of the time at m equals 60, 99.66% of the time at 280, and that was as high as I could go. So it's probably not too bad. Now, what about the infinite horizon problem? Well, remember that green line? It was like this for m equals 60 or 280. And if you keep increasing the sample size, because we want to do this on the whole population, the line goes like this and like this and like this, only logarithmically. And it converges to this solution. And this solution for an infinite sample says, oh no, we're back to Ronald Fisher. It actually says, if you have even slightly fewer red assignments, always assign red. And if you have even slightly fewer blue assignments, always assign blue. And therefore, you just alternate between red and blue, and you keep the sample sizes exactly equal. Okay? So that's not a very useful result. And it took me a while. You know, this is one of these problems you think about only in the shower every morning, and then you go work on more important things. It took me many showers before I realized that there's actually no mathematical way out of this. This is because what's missing here is another ethical principle, not a mathematical principle. So I'm going to propose to you a new ethical principle, which I call past-future parity. And that principle says, since patient M has benefited from m-1 previous patients, patient M should be obligated to him or herself benefit m-1 future patients, but no more. You see, if I let him benefit all the future patients, then I'm in this solution. But so I'm artificially, by an ethical principle, not a mathematical principle, restricting the horizon for each patient. And then it's a completely well-posed problem because I just use the strategy that has a 2m-1 in this argument for each patient m. It's, by the way, then computationally even less feasible, except that I've got the little heuristic, so I don't care. Okay. And now you can actually, play this game as if you were doing a real clinical trial and see how many patients you kill in the computer. And I like to say kill at this point. I mean, really, we were trying to decide whether two asthma drugs have small differences. But, it's more dramatic if we say it's a fatal disease, the placebo, there's no recognized treatment. You die if you get the placebo. And if our treatment is effective, you live. And how many people do we kill? Well, if you work it out, if we do a clinical trial of 100 and we do the standard method, so we put 50 in each arm, it turns out that if this is Bayesian, so there's a prior here, and I'm taking it to be uniform, and insert usual words here. We kill 16.6 people in our clinical trial. Okay. Now, if I do the exact backward iterative solution to the Bandit game, I kill only 1.74 people. If I do my heuristic solution, which is not quite right, I kill an extra 2/100ths of a person, okay? And if I do this extra ethical principle that lets me not have to know what M is in advance, okay, I kill only 1.85 people. And what you're supposed to take away from this is that these numbers are all small and about the same, and it's way less than this number. And there's also in the literature this slightly crazy idea that you should just play the winner, that each patient, you should look at what each patient did, and if they succeeded, give the next patient the same thing. I'll let you go play the winner, sort of self-describing. But there's a sort of a religious cult that believes in play the winner for, as far as I can tell, no good reason, because it actually doesn't even do that well. And as these things scale up, notice that these things are going to scale up basically linearly in the size, whereas I'm only going to increase logarithmically in the size. okay? Because basically I'm using all this very early information to very quickly decide what's the right treatment. And I think I said this, the gold standard are these numbers on the bottom. Good. Mal, how much time do I have? Okay, yeah, good. Okay, so you can actually generalize this in various ways, and I won't spend too long on this other than to get to the picture. You might ask, in the real world, we may want to take the dollar cost of treatment into account. So now we're back to inventing ethical cost functions. But it's trickier now, isn't it? Because we're not going to withhold, I'm asserting this because this is the only condition under which I'll work on this, I'm not going to withhold an effective treatment just because it costs more. But I am willing to try to minimize the amount of money I waste on the less effective treatment. Okay? So you can find in the literature a metric, dollar cost of failures. And I won't go through this. That means just what it says. In all your expected failures, you add up what they cost, and you try to minimize that. Notice there's no cost assigned to the successes here. And you might think that that was ethical, but when you actually work it out, you discover that this can actually result in strategies that favor the assignment of an inferior treatment. Okay? So maybe that's not a good idea. And as you can tell, I'm putting in blue new ethical principles that I'm inventing just for this occasion almost. So let's assert the new principle that if we know which treatment is better, what should I say? The cost should be lower of the better treatment than of the poorer treatment at any point. And so we'll try to invent something that obeys that. And it turns out it's not, you might have thought, oh no, you can never do that because somehow as soon as you bring in cost, it's always going to come out that way. But it's not true. If you define, this is the one I came up with, the expected dollar cost of treatment of lost successes. And again, those words would let you reconstruct the formula down here. And it turns out that has all of these good properties. It satisfies equality, it satisfies outcomes, it satisfies best treatment, okay? And so you can do exactly the same little bandit game with that and try to find heuristics for that. And they look like this. Now, to you, this looks the same as the previous graph, but I'll tell you what the difference is. The difference is that as the cost ratio of these two treatments goes up, this green line has shifted this way. So the green line is more to the left here. And what does that mean? That means that eventually we'll converge on what the best treatment is independent of cost. But while we're uncertain, we'll gather more data on the cheaper treatment than on the more expensive treatment in exactly such a way as to minimize that thing we're trying to minimize, the cost of treatment. I don't even remember my own acronym. The cost of treatment of lost successes. That's it. Okay. In particular, the cost ratio comes into this also only logarithmically in the heuristic. So these are all results that I hope Freeman will actually prove for me because I've only demonstrating them to you by numerical experiment. The picture on my first slide was the book Utopia. As soon as I put this in, I could sort of in my mind hear Freeman saying that he hates this book because it doesn't go nearly far enough. Because I'm sure, never mind. So here's my vision of a utopian future. Let's always test new drugs for safety. Okay, there's no way around that, and that would be similar to what are now phase 1 clinical trials, which are relatively speaking cheap compared with the later phases of clinical trials. And if maybe we're going to do a very limited test for efficacy just to keep from clogging the system, with sort of crackpot drugs for which there's no evidence at all. Mathematically, you don't need that at all, but maybe politically you do, and that would be similar to a small phase 2 trial now. But now we come to the key point, that after that point, we're not going to require any test for efficacy. we're just going to let the company put the drug on the market. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But we're only going to let them put it on the market in this comparative effectiveness research pool. And that means a physician is not allowed to prescribe it. A physician is only allowed to ask the patient if they would like to join this trial. And then the trial will suggest either the red dot or the blue dot as the evidence accumulates. Okay? So even a drug with no effectiveness at all is only going to kill, I'll stick with my extreme metaphor, 1 or 2 patients before it stops being recommended again on average. Because we saw that the Bandit game was very, very efficient at getting to the truth. And the reason for this limited test of efficacy is if you did a standard trial now on 20 patients, then that number, instead of being 1 or 2 patients, would be 0.05 or 0.02 patients, because you'd be starting already with a sharper prior when you enter that. So what's this going to do? Well, we're back to Jessica Rabbit. Jessica Rabbit is now going to have incentives for developing drugs that they're not incentivized to develop now. They will have rapid and low-cost access to a market with minimal marketing expenses. Okay? They won't have to do expensive phase 3 trials. And they won't be incentivized to create copycat drugs, because the copycat drug, unless it's actually more effective, will quickly stop being recommended and never make it into the market in the way that they're currently incentivized to try to do. So this has the prospect of fixing this very broken incentive structure. And I think I've really already said the best treatment will come to predominate in the recommendations, and it's quite rapid after only a few reported favorable outcomes in the case that treatments are actually substantially more effective. So here's what this is supposed to look like in this utopian future. Here's the happy physician and the happy patient. And, a lot of these pictures. I'm sure this picture was clipped off of a drug company website. So in my future, the physician says, the standard of care for your condition is the drug thanatozumab. But if you want, we can enroll you with the National Bandit Registry. Probably we need a better name than that, but this, you'll understand what I mean. They will suggest a treatment that, now the physician says this very carefully, based on the most current statistical evidence, is at least as good, okay? Because I think that's basically what the Bandit game guarantees. Depending on that evidence, the Bandit Registry may suggest thanatomazab or else a newer drug, okay? And the patient, in this case, says, sign me up. And is that from the Greek thanatos with mab for monoclonal antibody? So you can guess who I have in mind as the patient here. And I just want to thank you for listening.